May 14th, 1945. A limestone cave entrance in southern Okinawa, 2 miles north of Mabuni. Corporal Daniel Martinez crouched in the mud outside the cave mouth, listening to sounds that didn't belong in a combat zone. Children crying, voices whispering in Japanese, the shuffle of bodies against rock. His rifle hung across his back as he clicked on his flashlight and began crawling into the narrow opening, ignoring the standing order to clear caves with grenades or flamethrowers first. Behind him, Navy Corpsman James Foster followed with medical supplies and tin cans of fruit cocktail from their rations. The tunnel walls pressed close, damp with condensation and the metallic smell of fear. 30 feet in, Martinez saw them, a cluster of Okinawan children huddled against the stone, their faces pale with terror, some covering their mouths to stifle screams at the sight of American uniforms. One girl, no older than 7, held a grenade with the pin still intact. She had been taught what to do if the enemy came. Martinez slowly set down his flashlight and raised both empty hands. What happened in the caves of Okinawa during May and June 1945 revealed the war's cruelest paradox: American soldiers risking their lives not to kill the enemy, but to save children who had been taught that death was better than capture. The Battle of Okinawa had become a desperate race to save civilians from an ideology that convinced them Americans were monsters, and the only weapons that could win that battle were flashlights, food, and the willingness to crawl unarmed into the darkness. But to understand why children clutched grenades in limestone caves, one had to look back 3 months earlier, when the seeds of tragedy were planted in classrooms across the island. February 1945. A primary school in Shuri, central Okinawa. Morning assembly began not with lessons, but with a lecture from a visiting Imperial Army officer. He stood before rows of children aged 6 to 14 and explained what would happen when the Americans came. They would rape the women, he said. They would torture the men. They would mutilate children for sport. He described atrocities in graphic detail, his voice steady and clinical, as if reciting historical fact rather than propaganda designed to terrorize. Then came the instruction that would haunt the island for generations. If capture seemed imminent, families must choose death over dishonor. This was not cowardice, the officer explained, but the highest form of loyalty to the emperor. He used the word gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, a doctrine that glorified death in service of the nation. Survival meant shame, death meant honor. The officer distributed hand grenades to the teachers. Type 97 fragmentation grenades, each one capable of killing everyone in a small cave. The teachers accepted them with solemn bows, then passed them to the oldest students with instructions on how to pull the pin. Some children cried, others stood, silent, absorbing the terrible responsibility now placed in their hands. This scene repeated across Okinawa throughout February and March 1945. Japanese military authorities understood that the island would become a battlefield, and they prepared the civilian population not for evacuation or survival, but for mass suicide. Leaflets reinforced the message, distributed door to door in every village. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described fictional atrocities committed in Saipan and the Philippines, stories designed to make death seem preferable to capture. Families accepted the grenades because they believed they were protecting their children from something worse. Parents who loved their sons and daughters convinced themselves that a quick death from a grenade was mercy compared to the torture they had been promised. Love itself had been weaponized, twisted into a mechanism for self-destruction. The propaganda machine had achieved something more complete than military indoctrination. It had transformed protective instinct into a suicide pact. On April 1st, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa's western beaches. The sound of naval bombardment rolled across the island like continuous thunder. Families gathered what belongings they could carry and fled toward the limestone caves that honeycombed the southern hills. They carried food, water, blankets, and the grenades they had been taught to use. Behind them, their villages burned. Ahead lay darkness, hunger, and the terrible choice they had been trained to make. The Americans were coming, and the children had been taught there was only one way to survive their arrival. The Americans were coming, and the children had been taught there was only one way to survive their arrival. By early May, that lesson would be tested in the darkness of 1,000 limestone caves, where families waited for death and Marines prepared to deliver it. May 8th, 1945. Southern Okinawa, 2 miles east of Mabuni. The Nakamura family crawled deeper into the cave as another artillery barrage shook the hillside above them. Limestone dust fell from the ceiling in sheets, coating their hair and clothes with white powder. The father, Kenji, held his youngest daughter close while his wife Yuki tried to quiet the crying of their 3 other children. They had been in the cave for 6 days. The water was gone. The rice balls had been eaten 3 days earlier. Now there was only darkness, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the grenades wrapped in cloth at the back of the chamber. Outside, Corporal William Brennan of the 6th Marine Division approached the cave entrance with his flamethrower operator. They had cleared 11 caves that morning using the doctrine developed through bitter experience at Peleliu and Iwo Jima. First, they called out in Japanese using a loudspeaker. Then they waited 30 seconds. If no one emerged, the flamethrower went in. The tactic was brutal but tactically sound. Okinawa's cast limestone had been carved by centuries of rainfall into a maze of interconnected chambers, some large enough to hold 100 men. Japanese soldiers used these natural fortifications as firing positions, ammunition dumps, and hospitals. A single cave could shelter a machine gun nest that commanded an entire valley. The Marines had learned that negotiation was often fatal. At Kakazu Ridge 3 weeks earlier, a platoon had spent 2 hours trying to coax civilians from a cave. When they finally entered, a concealed soldier detonated explosives that killed 7 Americans. After that, the protocol became standard. Call out once, wait 30 seconds, burn it. Brennan raised his hand. The flamethrower operator stepped forward, checked his pressure gauge, and aimed the nozzle into the darkness. The fuel ignited with a roar that echoed off the stone walls. Orange flame poured into the cave mouth, sucking oxygen from the air and replacing it with superheated gases that would penetrate every chamber. The fire burned for 8 seconds, then silence. Inside, the Nakamura family pressed themselves against the far wall of a side chamber, protected from the direct blast by a turn in the tunnel. The heat was unbearable. The children screamed. Kenji reached for the grenade, his hands shaking, wondering if now was the moment they had prepared for. 20 minutes later, when the cave had cooled enough to enter, Navy Corpsman Michael Chen followed the Marines inside with his medical kit. The main chamber was charred black. 3 bodies lay near the entrance, Japanese soldiers who had been manning a defensive position. But in the side chamber, Chen found something that made him stop breathing. 2 small bodies, children no older than 5 and 7. They hadn't been armed. They had simply been hiding. Chen stumbled back outside and vomited in the mud. Brennan stood beside him, silent, staring at his flamethrower like it had betrayed him. Word spread through the company that afternoon. The caves weren't just military positions. They were shelters. The enemy they were burning wasn't always armed. Somewhere in those tunnels were families, children, people who had nowhere else to go. That night, in command posts across southern Okinawa, Marines began asking questions that the tactical manuals couldn't answer, but the caves still had to be cleared, and tomorrow there would be more. That night, in command posts across southern Okinawa, Marines began asking questions that the tactical manuals couldn't answer, but the caves still had to be cleared, and tomorrow there would be more. Within days, some men would decide to answer those questions not with fire, but with courage, of a different kind. May 14th, 1945. The same cave where Corporal Daniel Martinez would make his choice. He crouched outside the entrance in the afternoon heat, his rifle slung across his back, listening. The sounds coming from inside weren't the movements of soldiers repositioning weapons or the whispered commands of a defensive position. They were children crying. A woman's voice, soft and desperate, trying to quiet them. The shuffle of small bodies against stone. Martinez had cleared 17 caves in the past week. He knew the protocol. He knew the risks. Booby traps could be rigged to pressure plates invisible in the dark. A concealed soldier could wait in ambush with a knife or pistol. Civilians driven to desperation by propaganda could detonate grenades when Americans appeared, killing everyone in the confined space. Every tactical consideration said to follow procedure, call out, wait, then use the flamethrower or grenades. But he also knew what Navy Corpsman Chen had found 3 days earlier. He had seen the small bodies carried out on stretchers, had watched grown men sit in the mud afterward with their heads in their hands. The doctrine was designed to protect American lives by eliminating threats with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. It had been written by strategists who understood warfare but had never heard children crying in the dark. Martinez clicked on his flashlight, set down his rifle, and crawled into the cave. Behind him, Navy Corpsman James Foster grabbed his medical bag and followed without a word. No order had been given. No officer had authorized this deviation from protocol. It was a decision made by two men who decided that some risks were worth taking, even if it meant dying in a tunnel with nothing but a flashlight and tin cans of fruit cocktail. The tunnel walls pressed close, damp with condensation. Martinez moved slowly, calling out in broken Japanese, "Tasukemasu, Tasukemasu, we will help." His voice echoed off the stone. The crying stopped. 30 feet in, his flashlight beam found them. A cluster of Okinawan children huddled against the wall, their faces pale with terror. Some covered their mouths to stifle screams at the sight of American uniforms. An elderly woman held them close, her eyes wide with the certainty that the monsters from the propaganda posters had finally come. And one girl, no older than 7, held a grenade with the pin still intact. Martinez slowly set down his flashlight and raised both empty hands. He stayed perfectly still, letting them see he carried no weapon, made no threatening move. Foster crawled up beside him and carefully opened a can of fruit cocktail, the metal lid peeling back with a soft pop. He set it on the ground and pushed it forward with his fingertips, then retreated. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the smallest boy reached out and touched the can. He looked up at his mother, who nodded through her tears. The boy pulled the can closer and drank the syrup, then passed it to his sister. One by one, the children began to move toward the 2 Americans who had crawled into their darkness unarmed. It took 20 minutes to coax them out. When they emerged into daylight, 3 children, 2 elderly women, and 1 teenage girl still clutching the grenade, Martinez had to sit down. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization of what he had almost done if he had followed protocol. Foster carefully took the grenade from the girl's hand, secured the pin, and handed her a chocolate bar instead. That afternoon, Martinez told his squad what he had done. By evening, the story had spread through the company. No official order was issued, but officers who heard about it turned their heads and pretended not to notice when other Marines began entering caves with flashlights instead of flamethrowers. The doctrine remained unchanged in the tactical manuals, but in the field, something new was being written, 1 cave at a time, by men who chose crawling into darkness over burning it away. Dozens more caves remained across the ridgelines of southern Okinawa. Some would still end in tragedy, but now there was another option, and it began with 2 empty hands, raised in the dark. Dozens more caves remained across the ridgelines of southern Okinawa. Some would still end in tragedy. But now there was another option, and it began with two empty hands raised in the dark. The hardest part wouldn't be entering the caves, it would be convincing people that the monsters they'd been taught to fear were trying to save them. May 18th, 1945. A cave complex near the Maeda escarpment. Navy Corpsman James Foster crawled through the narrow entrance with PFC Thomas Hager, a Nisei interpreter from Hawaii whose parents had emigrated from Okinawa 30 years earlier. Foster's flashlight found them immediately. 12 civilians pressed against the far wall of the chamber. An elderly man stood in front, trembling, holding a grenade in both hands. Behind him, women clutched children who buried their faces to avoid looking at the American uniforms. Foster stopped crawling. He stayed perfectly still, speaking no words, making no sudden movements. Higa began talking softly in Okinawan dialect, explaining that they meant no harm, that they had food and water, that the children needed medicine. The old man's hands shook harder, his finger moved toward the pin. Outside the cave, 300 yards to the east, Imperial Japanese Army Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada watched through field glasses as another group of civilians emerged from a different cave, guided by American soldiers. He had seen this pattern developing over the past 4 days. The Americans were no longer burning the caves. They were emptying them peacefully, and with each rescue the Emperor's subjects were choosing survival over honor. This violated everything encoded in the Senjinkan, the Imperial Army's field service code that forbade surrender under any circumstances. The code was clear: death before dishonor, loyalty unto annihilation. Civilian capitulation represented not just personal shame, but national betrayal. Yamada turned to the 2 soldiers beside him and gave an order that would be documented decades later in testimony preserved at the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial. Any civilian attempting to leave the caves was to be stopped, by force if necessary. The civilians had been given grenades for a reason, and they would use them as instructed. The Emperor's subjects would not be permitted to collaborate with the enemy, even if it meant shooting them to prevent their surrender. Inside the cave, Higa continued talking. He explained that his own grandparents had lived in a village near Naha, that he understood their fear, that the stories they had been told were lies. Foster slowly opened a can of peaches and set it on the ground, then pushed it forward with his fingertips. The sweet smell filled the cave. A little girl, perhaps 4 years old, began to cry, not from fear now, but from hunger. The old man's hands stopped shaking. He looked at the grenade, then at the child, then back at Foster's empty hands. For 3 years, he had been told that Americans were devils, but devils didn't bring food. Devils didn't crawl unarmed into caves. Devils didn't speak his language with words of comfort. The grenade fell from his hands and rolled harmlessly across the stone floor. Foster carefully secured it while Higa helped the family toward the entrance. They emerged into daylight 20 minutes later. The little girl took Foster's hand as they walked toward the aid station. In that moment, 3 years of propaganda collapsed. But 200 yards away, concealed in a tree line, Yamada raised his pistol and fired 3 shots. The old man fell first, then a woman beside him. The others scrambled back toward the cave entrance, screaming. Not all Japanese soldiers followed such orders. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, positioned at a different cave complex that same afternoon, watched as a family prepared to emerge in response to American calls. His officer ordered him to shoot. Tanaka fired 3 rounds into the air instead, then claimed his rifle had jammed. The family escaped while he pretended to clear the malfunction. He would carry that act of disobedience as both shame and pride for the rest of his life. By late May, the pattern had become clear. Some caves ended in miraculous rescue, children emerging into light and safety. Others ended in silence, families who completed their suicide pacts minutes before rescuers arrived, choosing the death they had been taught was honorable. The Americans could offer food, medicine, and mercy. But they were racing against an enemy who offered only grenades and orders to use them. Time was running out for thousands still hiding in the darkness. Time was running out for thousands still hiding in the darkness. But by late May, what had begun as unauthorized acts of individual mercy was about to become something larger, a systematic campaign to save lives while winning a war. May the 28th, 1945. Hills above Uzerdake. Artillery batteries of the 96th Infantry Division held their fire as loudspeaker teams moved forward. The crews set up their equipment 300 yards from a cave complex that intelligence estimated held over 200 civilians. The loudspeakers crackled to life, and Nisei interpreter Staff Sergeant George Nakamura began speaking in carefully rehearsed Okinawan dialect. His message was simple. The war was nearly over. Surrender meant safety. Food and medical care waited at collection points marked with white flags. For 15 minutes, Nakamura repeated the message while Marines and soldiers stood ready, weapons lowered but prepared. Then, slowly, figures began emerging from the cave mouths. First one family, then another, then dozens, blinking against the sunlight they hadn't seen in weeks. Navy corpsmen moved forward immediately with water, food, and medical supplies. No shots were fired, no grenades were thrown. The artillery remained silent. This scene represented the culmination of a psychological warfare campaign that had been rapidly developed throughout May. The Office of War Information, working with military intelligence, had printed over 5 million leaflets in Japanese and dropped them across southern Okinawa. The leaflets, documented in U.S. Army Center of Military History records, featured safe conduct passes that promised food, water, and medical treatment to any civilian who surrendered. They included photographs of Okinawan families already in American care, eating meals and receiving medicine, visual proof that contradicted the propaganda. But leaflets alone couldn't overcome years of indoctrination. The real breakthrough came from expanding the role of Nisei soldiers like Nakamura and Thomas Higa. By early June, every frontline unit had been assigned Japanese-American interpreters who could speak Okinawan dialect. They were trained not just in translation, but in psychological approach, how to identify cultural gestures of submission, how to address elders with proper respect, how to use family terms that conveyed safety rather than threat. The military also established clearly marked safe zones behind the front lines, civilian collection points, where families could see other Okinawans already being cared for. These visible examples of American treatment became more powerful than any leaflet. By mid-June, the approach was yielding remarkable results. Hundreds of civilians emerged daily. The rate of civilian casualties dropped by more than 60% compared to April and early May. Commanders began recognizing an unexpected tactical benefit. Villages and cave complexes that surrendered peacefully no longer required costly assaults. Marines who would have spent days clearing fortified positions could advance faster with fewer casualties. Strategic mercy was also strategic efficiency. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding the 10th Army, noted in his diary that saving civilian lives was not just the moral course, but the tactically sound one. The shift represented something profound in the conduct of total war. For 3 years, the Pacific Campaign had been characterized by mutual brutality, no quarter asked, none given. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. American forces responded with overwhelming firepower. But on Okinawa, in the caves beneath the ridgelines, individual soldiers had demonstrated that another approach was possible. Their unauthorized mercy had been recognized, systematized, and scaled into official doctrine. Yet the victory was incomplete. For every family that emerged into safety in June, another had died in April or May, before the new protocols took effect. Thousands of civilians had completed their suicide pacts in the war's darkest hours, believing that death was the only escape from American capture. Some cave complexes, even in June, remained sealed. Families who refused all appeals, committed to the path they had been taught, was honorable. The loudspeakers would keep broadcasting. The leaflets would keep falling. But for too many, the message had come too late. The loudspeakers would keep broadcasting. The leaflets would keep falling. But for too many, the message had come too late. For those who emerged from the darkness, however, the hardest part was just beginning, learning to trust the enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. June 23, 1945. A medical tent near Itaman, 3 days after organized Japanese resistance collapsed. The girl sat on a folding cot while Navy Corpsman James Foster cleaned the infected cuts on her arms. She was the same child who had held the grenade in the cave on May 14th, the 7-year-old whose trembling hands had almost killed everyone in that limestone chamber. Now she sat perfectly still, watching Foster's every movement with eyes that couldn't decide between terror and confusion. He worked slowly, narrating each action in a calm voice even though she couldn't understand English, cleaning the wound, applying sulfur powder, wrapping the bandage. When he finished, he opened his ration pack and handed her a Hershey bar. She stared at the brown wrapper like it might explode. Foster unwrapped one corner to show her it was food, then stepped back and smiled. She took the smallest bite, and her eyes widened. Then she began to cry. Not from pain or fear, but from the cognitive dissonance of receiving kindness from the monsters she'd been taught would torture her. This scene repeated thousands of times across the civilian collection points that dotted southern Okinawa in late June. Post-war occupation records document the systematic effort to rehabilitate traumatized civilians, an undertaking that required more than medical care. It required deprogramming years of propaganda with consistent demonstrations of humanity. Navy corpsmen and Army medics became inadvertent psychologists, using chocolate bars, clean bandages, and gentle patience to prove that everything the civilians had been told was a lie. The challenge was immense. Children flinched at the sight of American uniforms. Elderly civilians refused food, certain it was poisoned. Some families sat in silence for days, waiting for the promised torture to begin, unable to comprehend why it never came. Nisei interpreters worked around the clock, explaining that the war was over, that they were safe, that no harm would come to them. Slowly, incrementally, trust began to form. By early July, the transformation was visible. Children who had hidden their faces now played baseball with Marines in the mud. Women who had clutched grenades now accepted medical treatment for malnutrition and disease. The collection points evolved into temporary villages where Okinawan families began rebuilding some semblance of normal life under American administration. Estimates suggest that between 800 and 1,500 civilians were saved through the cave rescue missions. Precise numbers remain undocumented because many rescues were never officially reported, executed by soldiers who had violated standing orders to achieve them. The speed of the transformation revealed something fundamental about human nature. Taught hatred, no matter how systematically drilled, could not survive consistent exposure to kindness. Children, who had been instructed to fear Americans as demons, discovered that these soldiers shared their rations, carried them on their backs when they were too weak to walk, and wept when they found bodies in the caves. The propaganda collapsed not through argument, but through action, yet the scars remained. The girl in Foster's medical tent would carry nightmares for the rest of her life, images of darkness, the weight of a grenade in her hands, the certainty that death was coming. Physical wounds healed in weeks. Psychological wounds would take decades. Some would never heal at all. Thousands of civilians had died in the caves during April and May, victims of a propaganda machine that convinced them mercy was impossible. The ones who survived would spend lifetimes wondering why they had believed the lies and grieving for those who had died believing them. On June 22nd, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was killed by Japanese artillery fire, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during World War II. The next day, organized resistance ended. The Battle of Okinawa was over, but in medical tents and collection points across the island, another battle continued, the struggle to heal wounds that explosives had never caused, and to answer questions that victory couldn't resolve. On June 22nd, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was killed by Japanese artillery fire, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during World War II. The next day, organized resistance ended. The Battle of Okinawa was over. But in medical tents and collection points across the island, another battle continued, the struggle to heal wounds that explosives had never caused, and to answer questions that victory couldn't resolve. 70 years later, those questions would finally find their answers in the voices of survivors who refused to let the story die. April 2015, the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. An elderly woman named Emiko Nakamura stood at the entrance to a preserved limestone cave, facing a group of American high school students on an educational tour. She was 82 years old. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared to speak, not from age, but from the weight of memory. This was the cave where she had waited to die in May 1945, a 7-year-old girl clutching a grenade because a teacher had told her it was the honorable thing to do. She began her testimony in Japanese, translated by a guide. She described the darkness, the hunger, the terror of hearing American voices outside. She described the moment when a soldier crawled into the cave with nothing but a flashlight, his rifle left behind in the mud. She described how he raised his empty hands and waited while fear battled with hunger in her child's mind. And she described the taste of canned peaches, the first food she had eaten in 6 days, offered by an enemy who was supposed to be a monster. The exact number of civilians saved through unauthorized cave rescues remains undocumented in official military records. The actions violated standing orders. Many rescues were never reported because the soldiers involved feared reprimand for abandoning doctrine. But survivor testimonies, preserved in archives like the Okinawa Peace Memorial and documented in oral history projects conducted by Japanese and American researchers, confirm what the after-action reports omitted. Individual American soldiers made moral choices that saved hundreds of lives, possibly over 1,000, by choosing mercy over efficiency and compassion over protocol. Emiko paused in her testimony, her eyes distant. The student group stood silent, some with tears on their faces. She told them that the American who saved her was a corporal from Texas named Daniel Martinez. She never learned his full name at the time. She was too young and too terrified to ask. But decades later, through veterans organizations and historical research, she had found him. They had corresponded by letter until his death in 2008. He had told her that crawling into that cave unarmed was both the most frightening and the most important thing he had ever done. He said he could still see her face in the darkness, could still feel the weight of knowing that one wrong move might have caused her to pull that pin. The greatest acts of courage, Emiko explained to the students, sometimes means setting down weapons rather than using them. The soldiers who burned the caves followed orders designed to protect American lives. The soldiers who crawled in unarmed followed something else, a human conscience that refused to accept that doctrine made killing children acceptable, even in war. Both groups were brave, but only one group proved that even in the machinery of total war, individual humanity could override the system. After her testimony concluded, Emiko led the group to a memorial stone outside the cave entrance. Names were inscribed in both English and Japanese, American soldiers and Japanese civilians, the ones who died and the ones who chose mercy. She knelt slowly, her old knees protesting, and placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the base. The students stood in respectful silence as she bowed her head. Somewhere in that stone was the name of the girl she had been, the child who held a grenade in the dark and lived because a stranger decided that risking his life to save hers was worth more than following orders. And beside her name, inscribed in memory, if not in stone, were the names of Marines and corpsmen who crawled into darkness with flashlights and canned fruit, who chose to see children instead of enemies, and who proved that even war cannot entirely extinguish the human capacity for mercy. The cave entrance behind them remained open, preserved as a reminder. Inside, the limestone walls still bore the scorch marks from flamethrowers, the evidence of doctrine. But outside, in the testimony of survivors and the flowers placed at memorial stones, lived the evidence of something stronger, the truth that conscience can triumph over training, that humanity can survive even the cruelest propaganda, and that the light of individual moral courage can reach into the deepest darkness.